New Conflagrations, the origins of World War II. Today we're going to discuss the drift to World War II and the beginnings of World War II. In the next lecture we will discuss the complications that occur to make World War II go on for such a long period of time and the results of that war. Lecture terms. Just like we did leading up to World War I, we're going to begin this lecture by discussing the factors leading to the war. And I'm going to go through these and I'm going to explain them in greater detail. First of all, one of the initial factors leading up to the war was one that actually led up to World War I. In fact, many historians refer to World War II as a continuation of World War I with a 20-year break, a 20-year ceasefire, if you will, because a lot of the factors are similar leading up to both wars. The first one, in particular, competition between nations, in particular over spheres of influence, imperialism. Just like we discussed before World War I, there's still a great deal of animosity and competition between nations over the lands that they control. The zero-sum game mindset is still in place. The belief that land equals power is still in place. And balance of power politics still control foreign policy decisions. So ultimately, we will see more and more conflicts between nations over spheres of influence as we lead up to World War II. In particular, when Germany starts to seize territory, we will see the problems that will result, even though initially the Western nations try to appease him. We'll discuss more about the implications of that as we move forward. The second factor is the failure of disarmament. One of the terms of the Versailles Treaty, as well as part of the initiatives of the League of Nations, was that all nations should disarm, so the arms race and the amping up of the arsenals would not give way to another world conflict. But unfortunately, there were a great number of nations that will ignore the disarmament parts of the treaties. And especially as we move into the early to mid-30s, we will see a massive buildup of arsenals in some of these nations. In particular, in the nations that are controlled by totalitarian regimes, whether left-wing or right-wing totalitarian dictators. We will see a great number of those totalitarian nations building up their arsenals as we move into the mid-30s. So disarmament failed, and this will lead, of course, to the third factor, the failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations supposedly had the ability to curb the aggressive nations ignoring treaty terms. But as we discussed in an earlier lecture, the League of Nations will have no teeth to enforce anything. And one of the big reasons for this is the fact that not all of the big power nations belonged to the League of Nations. In particular, the United States did not belong. The United States never ratified the Versailles Treaty, so therefore could not join the League of Nations, which was part of the treaty itself. And this will leave the League of Nations a kind of paper tiger, if you will. It has no real teeth to enforce anything as a result. The fourth factor was worldwide resentment of the Versailles Treaty. In particular, in the nation of Germany, we will see a great deal of resentment towards the Versailles Treaty itself, especially since Germany saw this as a dictated treaty. They were not able to come to the Paris Peace Conference to negotiate this treaty, yet they were forced to sign off on it or the war would continue. And as we discussed in an earlier lecture, there were a great number of very harsh terms directed primarily towards Germany. And this will cause a great deal of resentment among the German population towards the Western nations that they saw as dictating this treaty to them, this harsh, really unfeasible treaty. And this, of course, will lead to the rise of the Nazis, who promised to pull away from that treaty. We'll talk more about that as we move forward as well. A fifth factor are troubles that happen in the new states that were created after World War I. I mentioned before that there was that huge amount of territory that Russia had ceded over to Germany when Russia pulled out of the war. After the Russian Revolution and after the Bolsheviks take over, Lenin and his cronies negotiate a treaty with Germany to pull Russia out of the war. And Russia lost a huge chunk of their territory, on the western side of their territory. About 25% of their territory was ceded to Germany. Germany will not be able to capitalize on that territory because they only have control of it for, well, really less than a year. Because eventually they have to sue for peace and surrender in the war. And that territory was part of the territories that were taken away from Germany with the Versailles Treaty terms. Instead, not only these territories, but other territories that had once belonged to the Austrian Empire, as well as to the Ottoman Empire, both of which were dismantled after World War I, new states were carved out of these territories. And instead of really taking into consideration the different groups and the different interests of those groups that lived in those territories, the Western nations at the Paris Peace Conference started to arbitrarily draw borders on the map without considering the people living there. And so a great deal of the population of Eastern Europe did not feel that they were in a nation that represented their ideals. There were a great deal of ethnic groups that were unhappy with these arbitrary borders that were placed. And ultimately, that will allow for Hitler in particular to move into some of those areas, declaring national self-determination, sometimes posing himself as a, quote, liberator, and be able to seize those territories for himself ultimately. And we'll discuss more of that as we move forward. And of course, the final factor has to be the rise of totalitarianism due to the economic and political stresses that are a result of World War I. World War I, as we know, left a great deal of economic strife throughout the world. And the costs of the war were very high. Ultimately, the economic decline will become worse with the worldwide Great Depression that occurs. And economically depressed nations are more vulnerable to totalitarian takeovers, as we talked about in a previous lecture. These totalitarian dictators make promises, and people are willing to put aside perhaps their, quote, natural rights to a dictator in an emergency situation to try to pull themselves out of this economic decline and political decline as well. And these totalitarian regimes, whether of the left-wing variety, like we see in Russia with the Soviet communism, or of the right-wing variety, like we see in Italy and Germany with fascism, both of these kinds of totalitarianism use a kind of maniacal nationalism. In the case of the Soviet communism, It's really more of the idea of class um, being attacked, the idea of classes being attacked. Whereas with fascism, it's the target, of course, are different ethnic groups. We'll discuss how these factors come into play as we talk about the chain of events leading up to the war as we move forward in this lecture. The drift to World War II begins in the 30s. And we really are going to start here with Japan's war in China and the Chinese resistance to it. We discussed a little bit before about the implications of Japan taking over Manchuria between 1931 and 1932. I mentioned before that there was this Japanese aggression in the region originally spurred a united front policy between the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists. They will both of them oppose foreign influences like Japan. Guerrilla warfare will be utilized against the Japanese forces moving into Manchuria throughout the 30s. But eventually, this unity between the Chinese nationalists and communists will go by the wayside. And eventually, this will lead to a win for the Japanese in this region. There will be a full-scale invasion of Manchuria by 1937 that will result in the Japanese crackdown on the Chinese resistance in the region. One of the results will be the rape of Nanjing. It was Japanese aerial bombing of an urban center of Nanjing. In this aerial bombing, about 400,000 Chinese will perish. The aerial bombing allowed for the Japanese forces, the ground troops, to move in. After bombing from the air, they were able to move into the softened up defenses in Nanjing. And about, like I say, 400,000 Chinese will perish as a result. Many of them were used for bayonet practice and massacred. About 7,000 women were raped by the Japanese troops. And about a third of all of the Chinese homes in that city were destroyed. Japan will eventually, by the early 40s, sign a tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, a neutrality pact also with the Soviet Union in 1941, which will eventually go by the wayside. But this tripartite pact with Germany and Italy that is signed in 1940 is what eventually will allow for Japan to be part of the Axis powers in World War II. The communists in China, of course, will gain even more popular support by the end of the war by the end of World War II. The communists who had been exiled by the Chinese nationalists see what happens during World War II with more and more Japanese occupation as being the fault of those Chinese nationalists, and they will oppose that and be able to gain more popular support by the end of the war. It is after World War II that Mao and the Chinese nationalists are able to move back into China victorious and take over. Now, as I mentioned, the Axis powers in World War II will be Germany, Italy, and, of course, Japan will be added to that. Italy, much like their ally Germany, will be acting very aggressively when it comes to seizing territories as we move into the 30s. Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator in Italy, will start this process by moving into Ethiopia with an overpowering force in the early 30s. Now, if you recall, Ethiopia earlier on, back in the late 19th century, had been able to thwart an Italian invasion and remain themselves free of colonial occupation. But in the 1930s, Benito Mussolini and his forces will move into Ethiopia and take over the area. 2,000 Italian troops were killed, but 275,000 Ethiopians were killed. It was overkill, but that region will be a foothold for Italy in northern Africa, and Italy will ultimately have control over the Mediterranean basin, as well as this huge strategically important area in northern Africa through the beginnings of the war as a result. Italy also took control over Libya in northern Africa, as well as Albania. This important foothold for Italy will allow them to run amok in the Mediterranean throughout the first half of World War II. Germany, the other part of the Axis alliance, will also start acting very aggressively as we move into the mid to late 1930s. Now, you recall we discussed the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany, and we discussed how once Adolf Hitler gained totalitarian control in Germany with the Enabling Act of 1934, he was able to start pushing his agenda that he had outlined in his autobiography, Mein Kampf, which meant My Struggle. And one of the first things he will do is start to oppose and go against the terms of the Versailles Treaty. He will pull Germany out of the League of Nations and begin remilitarizing Germany. Those territories that have been demilitarized by the Versailles Treaty will start being occupied once again by Germany. The Rhineland, in particular, will start being remilitarized by Germany as we move into the late 30s. We will also see the idea of Hitler's Lebensraum, gaining living space for the Aryan race, will be taken to new levels by the late 1930s. For one thing, in 1938, we will see that the Germans take over Austria by declaring Anschluss, which means union. As we know, Austria was Hitler's homeland, but the Austrians were seen by the Germans as part of a greater Germanic state. And so therefore, it should be part of a greater Germany, part of the Third Reich. In 1938, the Nazis invade Austria and declare Anschluss. By the way, if any of you are familiar with the underlying story going on in The Sound of Music, it is when Anschluss is taking place. We also see a lot of pressure on the Sudetenland part of Czechoslovakia, one of those new states that had been created after World War I. Czechoslovakia was one of the most, I guess you would say, successful of the democracies that were created in Eastern Europe after World War I. But a territory, a part of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, was an area where there were a great number of Germanic ethnic groups living there. And this was an area that was also industrially rich. Germany, because they lost so many territories after World War I, had lost a great deal of their industrially rich territories. And so they need access to resources. And so the Sudetenland looked looked ripe for the taking to the Nazis in Germany. They ultimately will start to argue that since so many Germanic ethnic groups live in the Sudetenland, that under the policy of national self-determination, That area should therefore belong to Germany rather than Czechoslovakia. This will, of course, result in I guess you would say, a conflict or a turning point at the Munich Conference in 1938, which we'll discuss on the next slide. Now, I mentioned to you that once Hitler is able to gain totalitarian power in Germany with the Enabling Act of 1934, he will start to initiate his policies of Lebensraum, gaining territory for the growing Aryan race, and opposing the treaty terms of the Versailles Treaty. He wants to build Germany up to a position of power and glory and might once again. And that means that Germany must seize territory. So he knows that in order to do that, he is going to have to go to war again. What's interesting with Hitler is that he starts to gear up for World War II about 4 or 5 years earlier than any other nation does. He recognizes that in order to gain territory, he probably will eventually have to go to war to get it. But in the mid-30s, because the economic decline had been made so bad by the Great Depression, a lot of the Western nations who might have tried to thwart Hitler's aggressive territorial expansion earlier through the League of Nations, they will basically allow him to seize control over territories because they are more concerned with their own economic problems at home. Not only that, there are a great number of people who still very much remember the atrocities of World War I. It had not even been an entire generation yet since World War I, and many of them wanted to avoid going to war at all costs. And this is the mindset that leads to the appeasement policy that the Western nations take towards German aggression, German and Italian aggression, and even Japanese aggression, if you will, as we enter the late 1930s. I think the best example of the appeasement policy of the Western nations appeasing the dictators is with the Munich Conference of 1938. As I mentioned before, the issue was over the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. This was a territory that Hitler had declared should belong to Germany through national self-determination. Now, Czechoslovakia, if you recall, I mentioned was one of the most successful democracies that was carved out of those territories, those new nations that were created after World War I. And so Czechoslovakia appealed to the Western leadership in the League of Nations, in particular France and Great Britain, to try to keep the Sudetenland from being taken over by the Nazis, by Germany. And so this resulted in a conference being called. France and Great Britain called upon Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy to meet with the leadership of Great Britain and France in Munich to discuss the future of the Sudetenland. Great Britain sends their Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. France sends their Foreign Minister, Edward de Ladier. And of course, Germany has Hitler and Italy has Mussolini. Italy was incorporated in this negotiation because they had already formed the Axis alliance with Germany. Now, this conference over what was going to happen to the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia happened in Munich, which means it was on Hitler's turf. And if you see the membership of those attending the conference, you'll note that nobody from Czechoslovakia was invited, even though the fate of their territory was being determined. Now, when you look at the Munich Conference, you need to recognize that this is the epitome of the appeasement policy of the West. Hitler tried to win over the Western nations by basically saying, I just want the Sudetenland, I just really want national self-determination, which is what you Westerners always are touting, to happen, and that's all I want. I don't want to expand any further, which, of course, would prove to be untrue later on. But the British and the French delegates who went to the Munich Conference were so willing to deal with Hitler and Mussolini but to avoid another war that they bought into his promises, his empty promises. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who was in a very powerful position at home at this time, but his position was an elected position as Prime Minister, knew that the electorate back at home in England was so war-weary and so economically depressed after World War I that they did not want to go to war, especially over the small territory of the Sudetenland for Czechoslovakia. So Neville Chamberlain, as well as Edward de Lattier, allowed for Hitler to seize control over the Sudetenland, and they both came home heroes, having avoided war. As a matter of fact, Neville Chamberlain, British Prime Minister, came home saying that I have brought peace in our time. The willingness to appease Hitler over the Sudetenland will prove misguided within months of the Munich Conference of 1938. Not only did Hitler seize control over the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia was sold out by the British and the French, but also he will move in and take over the majority of Czechoslovakia as a whole. Hitler also began taking other territories in the same region, and so his promises of halting his expansionist efforts were completely not genuine. Within months, Neville Chamberlain will lose his power as Prime Minister in Great Britain. And instead, we will see the rise of another individual who was very much against the idea of appeasement from the beginning, and that is Winston Churchill. Another thing that we see happen by 1939, after the Munich Conference, is we see how Hitler, as well as Stalin, are both opportunists. Now remember, these guys are on complete opposite ends of the political spectrum. Yes, they're both totalitarian dictators, but one is right-wing, Hitler, and one is left-wing, Stalin. But Hitler recognizes that if war does occur, he wants to avoid the position that Germany was in First World War, fighting a two-front war. He knew that Russia wanted territories in Eastern Europe as much as Germany did, but he worried over fighting a two-front war. If Russia joined in with Great Britain and France should a war begin again, like they did before World War I, this would put Germany in a precarious position. So Hitler approached Stalin, and they negotiated a treaty of non-aggression in 1939. And basically what this stated was they were not allies, but they would stay out of each other's ways in their expansionist efforts in Eastern Europe. And ultimately this non-aggression pact, if you will, would allow for Hitler to avoid a two-front war if war did begin. Basically what Hitler was doing was he was playing a game of chicken with the West, recognizing that the West were backing down with the appeasement policy because they were so against going to war once again. He took advantage of the situation. He negotiated this non-aggression pact with Russia, and ultimately, if war did begin, which he thought might eventually, he would not have to fight a two-front war. August of 1939, Hitler had signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin. Just a year before, he had taken over not just the Sudetenland, but all of Czechoslovakia because the West were willing to back down through their appeasement policy. So why, by September of 1939, does World War II begin? As I mentioned before, it was determined within months after the Munich Conference that the appeasement of Hitler and Mussolini was ill-advised. And so, from that point forward, the West, meaning Great Britain and France, recognized that they were going to have to do something different very shortly in the future. If Hitler tried to seize another territory that was a prime territory that they had interest in, they may have to act. And that's what happened in the beginning of September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland. Poland was a territory that had lots of resources. As I mentioned before, Germany was short on resources because they had most of their resources taken away from them after World War I with their territorial losses. These were resources in Poland, coal, oil, etc., that Hitler really needed. And the West recognized by this point that if he takes over Poland, that he's going to continue to take over as many territories as he possibly could. That his promises to halt expansionist efforts that he had made at the Munich Conference were not genuine. So they will take action. When Hitler invades Poland on September 1st of 1939, Great Britain and France form an alliance, and by September 3rd, 1949, they declare war against Germany. The war begins, and ultimately, the Allied powers at this point are Great Britain and France versus the Axis powers, which were Germany, Italy, and Japan will be added to that Axis alliance by 1940. Now, revisionists wish to revise the post-World War I peace treaties at this point, but at this point it was a no-go. Great Britain and France, as I said, were the Allied powers at this point. The policy of appeasement that they had done in the couple of years leading up to this had proved ill-conceived. And so once they declare war on Germany, they now have to start getting ready for war. The appeasement policy, if you recall, meant that they were trying to avoid war prior to September 3rd of 1939. They were not ready for war, and as I mentioned to you before, Hitler had already been mobilizing for war since the mid-1930s. This means that at the beginning of the war, even though war has been declared by Great Britain and France on Germany and Italy, initially, because this is prior to 1940, when Japan was added to the alliance. This meant, however, that Great Britain and France needed to start the mobilization process. Hitler recognized that they were not ready for war yet, and so if he could seize the opportunity to take as much territory as he possibly could prior to them being ready to fight against him, he should do so. And so he launches a campaign to conquer Europe. He invades Poland, and Poland falls, like I said, within a week. He uses a new kind of warfare that will aid him in taking over territories extremely quickly. It's called blitzkrieg. Germany will use this new kind of warfare to conquer the majority of Europe very quickly within the first year and a half of the war's beginning, while the Allied powers are working very diligently to mobilize for the war. Blitzkrieg means lightning war. And the strategy was created because of the lack of resources that Germany had. They were short on resources. They recognized that they could not get bogged down in stalemate like they did in World War I with trench warfare. So they developed this new kind of warfare to avoid a prolonged fight. They can't get bogged down in stalemate. They need to gain territory as quickly as possible. Lightning war, blitzkrieg. They must keep moving to gain the resources that they lack. They do not have the resources to fight a stalemate kind of warfare. So blitzkrieg actually had a three-pronged effort. First of all, the air forces were sent in to soften up the target. The German Luftwaffe, meaning their air force, would be sent in and do an aerial assault on an area that they were trying to take over. They used this in Poland. Once they soften up the target with the air forces bombing them from above, they then will send in the armored tanks to punch through the front lines. Once the armored tanks, the panzer units, move in, then the infantry will move in behind them, the third prong. So air, then tanks, then infantry. And by using this kind of warfare so quick, as such a quick kind of shock and awe, if you will, attack, they were able to take over huge amounts of territory in Europe very quickly. Between September 1st, 1939, with the invasion of Poland, and 1940, the middle of 1940, Germany had taken over most of Eastern Europe, and they had forced France even to capitulate. They will also effectively use the same similar kind of tactics on the water with German U-boats, submarines patrolling the Atlantic and threatening the British shipping. British had just begun to mobilize, and so they were not able to thwart these efforts. From 1940, by the beginning of 1940, after taking over Poland, Germany was able to then move very quickly into Scandinavia, occupying Denmark, Norway, and Belgium. And then he will move to France. Now, France was still in the process of mobilizing to fight against Hitler. Hitler will be able to move into France so quickly that the French were not able to launch a counterattack. They had not begun mobilizing for war soon enough. And the Nazis forced the French to sign an armistice agreement by the middle of 1940, by June of 1940. It took about 30 days for France to capitulate, and France will be occupied by Germany until June of 1944, when D-Day occurs. This meant that now Great Britain was completely alone in their fight against the Axis powers. So the Axis powers dominate Europe and a good portion of Asia by 1940. France has been inoculated and occupied. All of Scandinavia has fallen to Germany. They have taken over all of Czechoslovakia and Poland. Italy is running amok in the Mediterranean and northern Africa. Japan is taking territories very quickly throughout Asia. Will Great Britain remain alone in the fight against the Axis? Between 1940 and 1941, we will see a large turn of events that will eventually bring new players into the war. In 1940, Great Britain's resolve and their ability to hang on in the face of this oppression by themselves eventually will lead to a shift against the Axis powers, with the entrance of both the Soviet Union and the United States into the war on the side of the Allies. Great Britain will not remain alone. We'll discuss more what happens through starting with 1940 through the remainder of the war in the next lecture. Thank you.